While playing Elden Ring, a game that I mostly enjoyed because of its beautiful world and lore, I had one reflection that came to mind. Though this game offers a lot of options in terms of building, it doesn't feel that great when fighting the tougher bosses. So I wondered why. I think I figured out my problem. In my opinion, the game lacks a balance in power levels. What's a power level? Let me explain it to you. Here's the first level of Mario. This is a Goomba. He's down. He can only move forward, even at the risk of falling. And this is a Koopa. He's just like the Goomba, but he doesn't fall. And when he dies, he can become a danger. And this is a flying Koopa. As the name implies, he can move now, and he's a danger vertically. And this is Mario. He can move forward, jump, run, power up, squish the Goomba, play with the Koopa's shell to attack, and jump higher than the flying one. That's what I call power levels in video games. Is the amount of features you have in a set game compared to the enemies, bosses, or even what the level needs you to do to achieve it. For the most part, enemies and obstacles are given lower power levels than you are, so the experience is more enjoyable and satisfying. Games tend to place multiple of those obstacles to make it more difficult, and this progressively, so you adapt throughout your playthrough, and as a reward, grow to become stronger thanks to the skills you developed, which is what we call the intrinsic reward, or gain any type of points, loots, costumes, and more, which we call the extrinsic reward. If the balance is done well, the frustration and boredom will rarely be the outcome of a challenge, which lands you right about there. This will make an enjoyable experience, where you want to improve or just continue to enjoy it. I think it doesn't need to be said, but your player base is of course a huge factor too. A Kirby game doesn't need to be as hard as Sifu on master difficulty, because of the players being way too young or just wanting to chill. You don't need to be a sweaty dude about everything when making these games. I'll try to show you some examples of how the power level is handled in relation to what you want the player to feel. In Yakuza, there is a ton of enemies we can call trash mobs. Those enemies are literally just there to be punching bags. Alone, they're kinda useless. Yakuza makes it more difficult by adding multiple of those enemies, such as in the long battles, or even gives some of those enemies more power, like the ability to grab you, throw you, parry you, not get staggered by your hits, and so forth. But all of it is mostly crushed by some mechanics that the game offers you. See, Yakuza is more akin to a power fantasy. Its goal is not to have a difficult gameplay, but to make you feel like a retired Yakuza, back to the business, a total badass who can even go toe-to-toe against sharks. Yeah, and does that thanks to the insane amount of power Kiryu has. He has this unique ability, compared to the rest of the cast, to do what we call hit moves. Contextual cutscenes that you can trigger by the push of a button. If you have a weapon in hand, are near some wall, obstacles, or any situation, even the weirdest ones, they absolutely obliterate enemies' health bar, have an insanely good feedback, and gives you invulnerability. In short, it's the best strategy and overpowered for the situation. These types of mechanics that put you on another tier of power are in most cases intended by the devs. They help you come out of a situation rather freely, so that the player doesn't ever feel overwhelmed. Most action games also have that, with very high damage moves, or even transformations. The other variation of that is a move that is more technical to pull off, but with higher reward, which is a neat thing to add to spice up your game. Let me present to you the Komaki Tiger Drop. With it, every attack that comes against you gets countered by an invincible counter-attack, which deals this amount of damage, and this with the same amount of feedback than the hit moves. Or you have what I consider the better alteration. The Royal Release. It rewards your mastery of the Royal style, which is all about recognizing the patterns and blocking the moves, by finally releasing all of the energy you collected thanks to those parries in one single hit, which does even more crazy amount of damage if done with the perfect timing. It's a great way to reward those who learn the timing of the enemy's actions, especially against bosses. It makes you feel even more like a badass when you pull it off. Speaking of bosses, while DMC tends to be a power fantasy in most of its duration, you can still struggle against hordes of enemies that do pose a threat when they become too much to handle, especially in harder difficulty. Some of them can dash as fast as you or faster than you. Some are surprisingly aggressive, some others are just annoying as hell. It depends. In most cases, we give some of those tools to the enemies we want the player to have trouble with, to even the playing field. An example of this will be normal enemies moving around. Well, there is this guy who's moving at the speed of light, chasing you around. In this instance, the normal guys still pose a threat, since they are tied to this more dangerous enemy. Bosses are even greater example of this, since they most likely have more tools compared to the usual enemy. That's what makes them bosses in the first place. A test of prior knowledge combined into one. Most of the bosses will test you in very simple ways, which rewards you for understanding how to use a certain amount of tools, while some others are made as rivals to you. They're usually designed to be cooler, and often break the rules by doing something similar to you. Virgil is the best example of this. While he does have a kit quite similar to you, you will maybe think that you have the upper hand by having the devil trigger, the optimal strategy, an easy way to get out of a hard situation, right? Well, fuck. He has it too. The Soul series does the exact opposite for its protagonists, while keeping the more impressive aspect of the bosses. They usually strip the player most of his strength, making him quite vulnerable, on top of everything in the game being attached to a commitment. An attack, healing yourself, running, or rolling, all is tied to a commitment. You also quickly notice something weird happening. You do this amount of damage, and this guy does this. Yeah, this gap in power level will most likely invade you with a sense of hopelessness. I'd call it the power tragedy. This invades most of the players with a sense of hopelessness at first, but those who are resilient will try against all odds to achieve the impossible, and remain the only being that hasn't gone hollow. This happens thanks to the enemies also having to commit to actions, leaving them with enough recovery for you to attack them. They are bound to the same rules as you, which is what made it all work in the first place, and gave you as a player enough hope and will to find more openings to punish them perfectly. This began to lessen in their following works, first starting with Bloodborne. It worked amazingly well in Bloodborne. The very aggressive and fast pace of the fights were a great inclusion because of the whole game supporting that playstyle. There's this mechanic of rally where even if you get hit, you can gain some of your health back by being aggressive and attacking your enemy back. The dodges were swift and quick too, and you had the easiest parry system of the series, a parry that worked in any range against enemies that mostly had slow windups. It made sense to make the bosses stronger in every sense of the way, but really they thought it would be a good idea to try that into the Souls formula. In Dark Souls 3 and more so in Elden Ring, bosses are way more aggressive, chaining long combos, can cancel their moves, or even the target states are over-designed to the brim, with status effects added on top of over-tuned moves, and so forth. Commitment isn't really in the equation anymore. It feels like they are playing DMC or Ninja Gaiden, while they are stuck in Dark Souls. Which leads the game to be a lot of waiting around the bosses stopping their dance for you to finally land something. It isn't necessarily bad to make it more defensive oriented, but it's a risk. It can quickly make it less engaging, which Sekiro did manage to avoid. Yes, of course you can beat them. I did it too. But there is way less interactivity between the enemy and the player. When the player is stuck in one heavy jump, while the boss can chain 52 attacks, be open for only 2 seconds because they decided to cancel their stagger states, and attack you with a combo of 100 moves afterwards, I don't think you can call that an interactive duel. Why Malinia's flurry of attack isn't interactable outside of throwing an ice pod at the beginning of the attack. Why can I not just try to use gravity against it? It makes sense, but the game doesn't allow for that to happen. The only reward you get from avoiding this amount of attacks is at most a charge attack, a heavy attack jump, or some magic spell.
In mind, Melania can be open after this attack, leaving a wide window while she's stuck in the animation. Normally, that would be the end of the read and your reward for successful evasion. However, she will sometimes cancel this immediately into a leap upward. This bounce not only escapes your attack, it leaves you stuck in an attack animation that you thought was safe. Instead, you're now dead for taking a trap opening that is inconsistently free.
Because of all the weird long combos, cancelling, including dodges in a move, or extremely delayed attacks, you often get out of the flow state, which is somewhat of a pity for a game that wants to be this intense. Some of the solutions are either some broken spell or the use of a companion, but the bosses clearly weren't built around that. They can hardly manage having to deal with two opponents, and it shows. The only being Radan, with his moves taking a big portion of the area around him, since he was made to be fought alongside the NPCs you met during your journey. That's why it feels like summoning anything trivializes most of 1v1 bosses, while sometimes the duo bosses are so badly mashed up, compared to the likes of Osi and Smo, or the two Prince Demons, which work together thanks to either a different speed between the two, or different ranges, that it becomes a necessity to cheat through it if you don't want to end up mad. Finding the right spot to make your experience the most enjoyable possible while keeping the challenge up is way too convoluted, and will most likely never happen in your first playthrough. The most regrettable part is that they made a game where they nailed the power balance perfectly. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Because of how tightly it's designed thanks to the lack of an RPG system, the main protagonist really is on equal grounds against his enemies. Parries, thrust attacks, long wind-ups for special moves or grabs. Some bosses even have the same moves as you, like the ninja tools, use of fire, lightning, diversion and more. It was another interesting step towards more interesting combat, by finally including verticality, which brings a lot to the usual Soulsborne gameplay. You can now approach defense and aggressivity in a totally new way, which doesn't punish you with less interactivity. Defensive play is still being quite efficient and fun compared to Elden Ring, and all that thanks to the posture mechanic. You can also cancel some of your moves while keeping the same commitment design. Because of every move still mattering and you being messy will punish you with a broken posture. Thanks to that, you can really have a cool situation unique to Sekiro. Some of the enemy's movement is a reaction to yours that you can play around. For example, you can feint a charge attack by cancelling it with your guard against Genichiro. This will bait him into defending himself and cancelling his hits too, thus giving you an opportunity or more time to recover your posture. You can even approach defense in so many ways. Like against Al, you can let him blow up your posture in specific parts to get some free hits, which otherwise you wouldn't. Or when there is some hits that make you slide on the ground because of sheer power of the hit. Well, you can avoid that by doing regular dodges, jumping, breaking the attack with a tool, or even just deflect while jumping to totally negate the act of sliding on the ground, making you recover faster. I can list a ton of features like that make you play around the mechanics of all the enemies in terms of defense and offense. Thanks to it, Sekiro is a very well balanced game around power levels being equal for most of the entities that aren't trash mobs, on top of giving you enough freedom to play around with the numerous approaches it has. Everyone can feel the same amount of success and pride when defeating those enemies, something FromSoft always strive towards, but really forgot for Elden Ring by introducing bosses or character builds that have power level of the shots, making the balance quite chaotic. I would suggest watching some of Ongball's gameplay to learn about the many mechanics of the game. To me, Sekiro is kinda the masterpiece of the studio when it comes to gameplay, which is a bit of a shame to have downgraded in those aspects, right after making the right choices. Well, that's it. Those are some of the available paths you have in a video game, according to the feeling you want your player to have. Do you want him to feel powerful? Do you want him to feel weak? This is a thing quite difficult to balance, and in my opinion is where Elden Ring kinda fumbled towards the end, betraying its own design philosophy to sadly conform to to a wider user base.